At 9:30 in the morning, on May 1st, 1942, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki stood in the converted mess hall of the battleship Yamato, watching junior officers arrange wooden blocks on a massive game table that represented the Pacific Ocean. Around him, 20 senior admirals in dress uniforms filed into the room, each followed by staff officers carrying folders of operational plans. They had come to play a war game, to test the strategy that would win the Pacific War for Japan. The target was Midway Island, a tiny atoll 1,400 miles northwest of Hawaii. The plan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's masterpiece: lure the American carriers into a trap, destroy them in a single decisive battle, and force the United States to negotiate peace. It was brilliant, complex, and involved coordinating hundreds of ships across thousands of miles of ocean. The war game would expose any flaws before the real battle began, except the game was rigged from the start. Ugaki was the chief umpire, the man who would interpret dice rolls and determine outcomes. He was also Yamamoto's chief of staff, the architect of much of the plan being tested. He had a vested interest in proving the operation would succeed. And when the dice predicted disaster, he simply changed the rules. Japan, in May of 1942, was drunk on victory. In 6 months, the Imperial Navy had conquered an empire stretching from the Aleutians to the Dutch East Indies. The string of successes seemed endless. On December 7, 1941, 6 Japanese carriers had struck Pearl Harbor, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and killing more than 2,400 Americans. 10 hours later, Japanese bombers destroyed most of the American Air Force in the Philippines on the ground. 2 days after that, Japanese aircraft sank the British battleship Prince of Wales and battle cruiser Repulse off the coast of Malaya, proving that even the most powerful warships were vulnerable to air attack. The conquests continued through the winter. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Manila fell on January 2nd. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore surrendered on February 15th, with 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops taken prisoner. The Dutch East Indies collapsed in March, giving Japan access to the oil fields it desperately needed. Burma fell in May, cutting the supply route to China and threatening India. The aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had struck across the Pacific without suffering a single loss. They had attacked Pearl Harbor, supported invasions across Southeast Asia, raided into the Indian Ocean, and sunk the British carrier Hermes off Ceylon. Japanese pilots flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, the finest carrier fighter in the world. In the first 6 months of war, Zeros had dominated every opponent they faced. Allied pilots reported the Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outrange anything the British or Americans could put in the air. Japanese planners believed they were invincible. Every operation had succeeded. Every battle had been won. The Americans and British seemed incapable of stopping Japanese forces anywhere. Military leaders in Tokyo spoke confidently of dictating peace terms within months. The idea that Japan might actually lose a major battle seemed absurd. They called it victory disease. The assumption that success would continue simply because it had succeeded before. The refusal to acknowledge that the enemy might adapt, might learn, might get lucky. The overconfidence that comes from winning so many battles that you stop seriously considering you might lose the next one. Victory disease infected Japanese planning at every level, from junior officers to admirals to the highest levels of government. That disease infected the war games from the moment they began. The games took place over 4 days in early May aboard Yamato, anchored at Hashirajima in Japan's inland sea. The ship was the largest battleship ever built, 72,000 tons of steel and firepower, mounting 9 18-inch guns that could hurl shells weighing more than a ton over 25 miles. She was a floating symbol of Japanese naval might, and using her as the venue for the war games sent a message about the importance of the operation being planned. The mess hall had been cleared of furniture and replaced with a scale model of the Pacific. The table measured nearly 40 feet across, covered with a gridded map showing Midway, Hawaii, and the vast ocean between them. Wooden blocks represented ships, each labeled with the name and type of vessel. Colored pins marked positions and movements. Dice determined combat results, introducing the element of chance that made war unpredictable. Multiple umpires sat around the table, each responsible for different aspects of the simulation. They would roll dice, consult damage tables, calculate fuel consumption, and determine the outcomes of engagements. The war game was supposed to be comprehensive. It would simulate not just the carrier battle, but the entire operation. The diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands, the movement of the invasion force toward Midway, the positioning of submarines to intercept American reinforcements, the bombardment of Midway by battleships, the landing of troops, the establishment of air bases on the captured island. Every phase of the operation would be tested on the game table before a single ship left port. In theory, the purpose was to fight the battle on paper first, to find problems and fix them before real ships and real men faced real combat. Honest wargaming could reveal flaws in timing, expose logistical problems, identify tactical vulnerabilities. A good wargame could save lives by preventing bad plans from being executed. In practice, the games became a formality, a scripted exercise designed to validate a plan that senior officers had already approved. Nobody wanted to find problems. Everyone wanted confirmation that the operation would succeed exactly as designed. The war games had become a ritual, not a test. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the carrier strike force, the 4 carriers that would attack Midway and engage the American fleet. Nagumo had led the Pearl Harbor attack. He was experienced, competent, and deeply aware that combined fleet headquarters did not trust him. Yamamoto's staff had criticized Nagumo for not launching a 3rd strike at Pearl Harbor, for not pursuing and destroying American carriers that had escaped the attack. Nagumo knew he was on thin ice, so when the war games began, he stayed quiet, asked no hard questions, and raised no objections. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo commanded the invasion force, the transports and support ships that would land troops on Midway after the carriers had neutralized American defenses. Kondo was more outspoken. He looked at the plan and saw problems immediately. How would they resupply Midway after capturing it? The island was 1,400 miles from the nearest Japanese base. Supplying a garrison that far forward would require constant convoys vulnerable to submarine attack. If they could not keep Midway supplied, they would have to withdraw, making the entire operation pointless. Yamamoto's staff admitted resupply might be difficult, maybe impossible. But the plan was already approved. Kondo's concerns were noted and ignored. The first day of gaming proceeded smoothly. Japanese forces advanced according to schedule. American forces reacted exactly as predicted. Umpires rolled dice to determine combat results and consistently ruled in favor of Japanese forces. When dice suggested Japanese losses, Ugaki intervened to reduce the damage or eliminate it entirely. The critical moment came on the 2nd day. The game scenario had progressed to the point where Nagumo's carriers were attacking Midway Island. Japanese aircraft bombed the airfield, while the carriers prepared for a follow-up strike. Then the American player, a junior officer whose name was never recorded, made an aggressive move. He sent land-based bombers from Midway to attack the Japanese carriers while their own aircraft were away. In real combat, this was precisely the kind of opportunistic strike that could devastate a carrier force. Carriers are most vulnerable when their aircraft are in the air, when flight decks are crowded with armed and fueled planes preparing to launch or land. A well-timed bombing attack on a carrier deck covered in aviation fuel and ordnance could create a catastrophic chain reaction. The umpire for this phase of the game was Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, a carrier division staff officer. Following the rules, Okumiya rolled dice to determine how many hits the American bombers scored on the Japanese carriers. The dice showed a 9. According to the damage tables, 9 hits meant 2 carriers sunk. Akagi and Kaga, the largest carriers in the strike force, were ruled destroyed. Ugaki watched this result with visible displeasure. 2 carriers sunk by land-based bombers? Impossible. He did not believe the Americans would be that aggressive. Even if they were, Japanese carriers could defend themselves. The Zeros would intercept the bombers. Anti-aircraft fire would shoot down survivors. Maybe a few bombs would get through, but not enough to sink 2 carriers. Ugaki overruled the dice. He reduced the hits from 9 to 3. Kaga was still sunk, but Akagi was only damaged, still operational. The game continued. Okumiya was surprised but said nothing. He was a lieutenant commander. Ugaki was a rear admiral and Yamamoto's right hand. Objecting would accomplish nothing and might damage Okumiya's career. The other officers in the room watched this intervention and understood the message. The games were not designed to expose problems. They were designed to confirm success. But even the reduced damage was too much for Ugaki to accept. Later in the games, when the scenario moved to the next phase of operations, the invasion of New Caledonia and Fiji, Kaga mysteriously reappeared. The carrier that had been sunk hours earlier in game time was back on the board, ready to participate in the next operation. No explanation was given. The umpire had simply decided that sinking Kaga was inconvenient to the overall plan, so Kaga would not stay sunk. This was not the only manipulation. Throughout the 4 days of gaming, whenever dice rolls suggested Japanese losses or setbacks, Ugaki intervened. Air combat results were adjusted in Japan's favor. American forces behaved in ways that made them easy to defeat. Scenarios that might expose flaws in the plan were ruled unrealistic and rerun until they produced acceptable results. The most revealing manipulation involved American carrier movements. In the actual plan, Yamamoto expected American carriers to sortie from Pearl Harbor after the attack on Midway began, racing to defend the island and walking into the trap Japanese forces had prepared. But in the war games, the American player tried a different strategy. He sortied carriers early, positioning them near Midway before the Japanese attack began, allowing them to strike first. This was exactly what would happen in the real battle 1 month later. But in the game, Ugaki ruled this scenario impossible. The Americans could not possibly know the attack was coming. They could not position carriers in advance. The American player was forced to keep his carriers at Pearl Harbor until after the Japanese struck Midway, exactly as Yamamoto's plan assumed they would. One officer did speak up. Commander Minoru Genda, one of the most brilliant carrier tacticians in the Japanese Navy, was troubled by the assumption that Americans would not sortie early. Genda had planned the Pearl Harbor attack. He understood that Americans were capable of surprise and aggression. He warned that if American carriers were already near Midway when the attack began, the entire operation could be in jeopardy. Genda's concerns were acknowledged and dismissed. The plan assumed Americans would react, not anticipate. Changing that assumption would require redesigning the entire operation. Nobody wanted to do that. The games had already validated the plan. Questions were unwelcome. By the end of 4 days, the war games had confirmed exactly what senior officers wanted, confirmed. The Midway operation would succeed. American carriers would be destroyed. Japan would win a decisive victory that would force the United States to negotiate peace. Officers left the Yamato confident the plan was sound. The problem was that confidence was built on lies. The first lie was that Japanese intelligence was reliable. In reality, American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval code designated JN-25. Since early 1942, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station HYPO in Hawaii had been reading fragments of Japanese radio traffic. By April, they knew Japan was planning a major operation against a target code named AF. Rochefort believed AF was Midway, but Washington disagreed. To prove his case, Rochefort devised a simple trick. He had the base at Midway send an unencrypted radio message reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down and the island was running short of fresh water. It was a complete fabrication, but Japanese intelligence intercepted the message and fell for it. 2 days later, on May 22nd, American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese intelligence report stating that AF was short of water. Rochefort had his proof. AF was Midway. The Americans knew where the attack would come and roughly when it would happen. Japan had no idea the Americans were reading their mail. The war games on Yamato proceeded on the assumption that strategic surprise was guaranteed, but surprise was already lost. The fundamental premise of Yamamoto's plan was compromised before the first ship left port. The second lie was about American carrier strength. At the Battle of Coral Sea in early May, Japanese and American carrier forces had fought the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never sighted each other. All the fighting was done by aircraft. The battle was part of Japan's operation to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea, which would threaten Australia and extend Japanese control over the South Pacific. The battle lasted 2 days. On May 7th, American aircraft sank the light carrier Shoho. On May 8th, both sides launched major strikes. Japanese aircraft damaged the carrier Yorktown and delivered devastating attacks on Lexington. Multiple torpedo and bomb hits set Lexington ablaze. Despite heroic damage control efforts, fires reached the aviation fuel storage, triggering massive explosions. The crew abandoned ship, and Lexington was scuttled by American destroyers. Japan lost the light carrier Shoho and suffered damage to the fleet carrier Shokaku, severe enough to put her out of action for months. Another fleet carrier, Zuikaku, lost so many aircraft and pilots that she could not participate in the Midway operation, even though the ship itself was undamaged. Japanese intelligence assessed Yorktown as sunk alongside Lexington. Pilots reported seeing both American carriers burning and dead in the water. The assessment seemed reasonable, but the reality was different. Yorktown had taken a single bomb hit that penetrated deep into the ship before exploding, but skilled damage control had contained the damage. The ship limped away from the battle, trailing oil but still under power. Japanese intelligence concluded that only 2 American carriers remained operational, Enterprise and Hornet. The Midway plan was built around facing 2 carriers, a force Japanese planners believed their 4 carriers could easily defeat. The math seemed simple: 4 carriers against 2. Experienced Japanese pilots against inexperienced Americans. Superior Japanese aircraft against inferior American planes. Victory seemed certain. In reality, Yorktown had not sunk. The ship limped back to Pearl Harbor with a massive hole in the flight deck and structural damage that would normally require 3 months in a shipyard to repair. A 551-pound bomb had penetrated through 6 decks before exploding above the forward engine room. The explosion destroyed 6 watertight compartments, killed 66 men, wrecked the elevator machinery, disabled the radar and refrigeration systems, and opened seams along 30 hull frames. Fuel oil leaked into the ocean, leaving a slick that stretched for miles behind the ship. Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, who inspected the damage during the voyage back to Hawaii, estimated repairs would take 90 days under normal circumstances. But Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, did not have 90 days. Station HYPO had broken the Japanese codes. Rochefort's team knew the Japanese were planning a major operation. They knew the target was Midway. They knew the approximate date of the attack. Nimitz needed every carrier he could put to sea. He could not afford to leave Yorktown in dry dock while the battle was fought. But Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, did not have 90 days. He ordered Pearl Harbor's repair crews to do the impossible. When Yorktown arrived on May 27th, 1 day ahead of schedule, Nimitz cut orders voiding safety regulations. Normally, the ship would spend a full day purging aviation fuel from storage tanks before entering dry dock. Nimitz ordered the ship into dry dock, number 1 immediately, with fuel still aboard. More than 1,400 shipyard workers swarmed over Yorktown. They worked around the clock for 72 hours straight, welding steel plates, patching holes, restoring systems. Rolling blackouts across Oahu provided electricity for the massive welding effort. On May 30th, 3 days after entering port, Yorktown put to sea with some repair crews still aboard finishing work as the ship headed for battle. The ship was not fully repaired, but it was operational. Japan would face 3 carriers, not 2. The third lie was about timing. Yamamoto's plan assumed American carriers would not sortie until after the attack on Midway began. The carriers were supposedly at Pearl Harbor, nearly 1,400 miles away. Even if they raced to Midway at maximum speed the moment the attack started, they could not arrive until the 2nd or 3rd day of battle. By then, Japanese forces would have captured the island and would be waiting in prepared positions. But Nimitz knew when the attack was coming. He sent Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown to sea days before the Japanese fleet arrived, positioning them northeast of Midway at a predetermined rendezvous point called Point Luck. On the morning of June 4th, when Nagumo's carriers launched their attack on Midway, American carriers were already in position 200 miles away, waiting to strike. The real battle began exactly 1 month after the war games ended. At 0430 on June 4th, 1942, Nagumo launched the first strike against Midway. 36 dive bombers, 36 torpedo bombers, and 36 Zero fighters headed for the island, while the carriers prepared a second wave armed with torpedoes to attack American ships if they appeared. At the same time, Nagumo launched 7 reconnaissance aircraft to search for American forces, but the search was poorly organized. Too few aircraft covering too much ocean, flying in bad weather, taking off late due to mechanical problems. One scout from the cruiser, Tone, was delayed by 30 minutes, a delay that would prove catastrophic. The attack on Midway caused damage but failed to neutralize the island's defenses. The strike leader radioed back that a second attack was necessary. Nagumo made the decision that would doom his fleet. He ordered the second wave of aircraft, which were armed with torpedoes for attacking ships, to be rearmed with bombs for attacking land targets. Deck crews went to work removing torpedoes, bringing planes down to the hangar deck, swapping weapons, bringing planes back up. It was organized chaos, and it left the carriers vulnerable. At 0728, one of Nagumo's scouts finally reported sighting American ships. The message was vague, giving no indication of whether carriers were present. Nagumo hesitated. Should he continue rearming for a second strike on Midway, or should he prepare to attack American ships? He ordered the rearming to stop, then changed his mind again when a follow-up message confirmed American carriers were present. Now he needed to rearm again, putting torpedoes back on aircraft that had just had bombs loaded. More time lost. More confusion. By mid-morning, Nagumo's flight decks were covered with armed and fueled aircraft, ammunition, and ordnance. Exactly the scenario the war games should have identified as dangerous. Exactly the situation Okumiya's dice roll had predicted. But because Ugaki had dismissed that scenario as unrealistic, no precautions had been taken. American attacks began at 09:30.